Hello and welcome to problem number 68 from the best move. In this case, we have white to move, and the prompt is the same as the last one that we just had. From 67, is white better, equal, or worse? And what is white's best move in the position? This is a much more positional situation than the previous problem, and so we're thinking probably in a lot more in the sense of plans and ideas than we are in terms of tactical continuations. So to start with, it's important, of course, to think about the position and evaluate it and try and get a sense of whose position we like better. Instinctively, I like white because these are wonderful pawns. White has space. He can, if he wants to, play pawn to d5 and close the position and keep a nice space advantage. I don't know that I like pawn to d5 in general, although it is there as an option because I don't really want to allow knight to c5. And that hole would be relatively permanent and would seem to me to give black a relatively nice game. So the one thing that I really don't like about this position for white is his bishop on g3 here. This pawn formation with e5, f6, and g5 really shuts off white's bishop. White would like to play pawn to h4, for instance, to attack that structure, to loosen it, and to eventually garner some prospects for his bishop, but that's just met with h6, and again that pawn formation is effective in clamping down on white's bishop. Maybe an alternative for white that would appeal, if possible, is the idea of at some point playing pawn to f3 and then bishop back to g3. Since that's there in the long term, it may be that I'm overestimating the importance of black's pawn formation in controlling the white bishop, because it does seem that at some point white would always be able to retreat the bishop in this way and get it back into the game. So it's only temporarily out of play. Of course, black to move might very well consider pawn to h5, which immediately threatens pawn to h4 and generates some unpleasant pressure on the king side. And that would probably mean that we'd have to play pawn to h4 or pawn to h3 to allow the bishop to retreat to h2, which is not very inspiring. Maybe that suggests that it's already time for the knight on f3 to move away so that we're ready to meet something like pawn to h5 with f3. Although moving the knight already prevents pawn to h5 because we have our bishop on e2 being opened up, which I kind of like. At this point, I'm thinking very strongly about moving this knight for white, and I'm not so worried about moving the knight as I am just getting it off of f3 to clear the path for the white bishop and to allow the dark squared bishop to come back into play. So that leaves knight e1 and knight d2, both of which seem like playable moves to me, but they don't seem particularly inspiring, I guess. I don't think you can play knight d2 in this position if you were to want to, because pawn to c6 for black would seem to indicate that white would want to play knight c3. Maybe he has to play knight a3 at this point. Or actually, knight a3 or knight c3 are identical in that in either case, I think black is going to capture on d4. And he's gained a pawn, at least temporarily, probably more than temporarily, because he's going to play pawn to c5 to secure that pawn. And so white's losing a pawn. If he plays knight d2, that's not very appealing. I should probably also point out that black might consider capturing on d4 no matter what white does, with the idea of freeing up e5 for his knights. Both of his knights here seem to me at the moment to lack squares. Black would like to get rid of this pawn on d4 in some way, so that his knights would have the squares e5 and c5, which are good squares and would seem to offer black a pretty decent game. If that's the case, maybe white would like to play pawn d5 here, and he's willing to grant black the square on c5 for his knight on d7 in return for keeping the knight on f7 out of play. That seems a bit much of a concession to me, and I would be reluctant to make that move. But I'm not sure. I guess I'm not sure if I need to prevent e takes d4 for black. I don't really like that after e takes d4, black's knights seem to have some really nice squares. But on the other hand, I retain my space advantage. Black also has holes on f5, and also it seems like a knight could be good on d5, so perhaps this is a reasonable exchange, and I shouldn't try to prevent e takes d4. Perhaps it's foolish to try and restrain black's knights with a move like d5 if I'm making compromises in my own position. I'm thinking about playing pawn to c5. And my idea behind playing pawn to c5 is that perhaps black's pieces are extremely ill-placed for an opening of the position. If I can open the c file, or if I can open the d file by an exchange on c5, for instance, if black was, I think, foolish enough to make this exchange, my rook would be lined up with his queen. I would think that that would be quite appealing. I might also be in position after c5 to play pawn to c6 and create a lot of loose squares and weaknesses on the queen side. Some good pawn targets like the pawn on c7. Black seems to be ready to play pawn to c6 if he wants to push my knight away, but after c5 he can't push my knight away in that fashion because d6 will be loose, because I'm adding the pawn on c5 to attack d6. Perhaps after pawn to c5 black would take on d4, but I would just capture on d6. And black is going to end up with a very weak pawn on d6. So after pawn c5, pawn captures d4, capture on d6, I think white has a very good position. In addition, there's the advantage that pawn c5 opens up the diagonal to black's king, and white may be able to make very good use of that diagonal with bishop c4. His bishop at the moment seems to be bad, but the pawn structure is not fully locked, so after c5 the bishop has really good prospects after bishop c4. The queen may also come to c4 or to b3, and the knight on f7 could be a very serious target. I see enough here that I would play pawn c5 at this point. It took me a little bit of time to get to thinking about pawn c5. I was thinking more in a closed positional vein and thinking about piece maneuvering. But the position's not really closed yet. White hasn't played a move like pawn d5, so there's still the opportunity for a tactical solution to the position. And I think pawn c5 is very appealing. I don't see any lines that I particularly like for black, and in the absence of seeing lines I like for black, this move just makes too much sense for me to not play it, I guess. I do see one more thing I need to consider here before playing pawn c5, and that is the move h5. I discussed this earlier. There is the idea of playing pawn to h4 and trapping white's bishop. My immediate instinct is that that threat is irrelevant, that white has more threats. He can capture on d6 at this point, and black can choose to trap the bishop, but white's going to play knight takes c7, forking the rooks on a8 and on e8. And even if black gets the bishop, it's just not going to be enough material. So white's threats are primary, and c5 forces black on the defensive. I think that after c5, white should have a very clear advantage. Well, I'm right about this particular problem. I don't feel as great about it as I might like to. c5 is absolutely the right move. White's advantage positionally is so strong that I said he was clearly better. He might even be winning. It's tremendous. After I saw c5, I did like it quite a lot, and I didn't hesitate very much about playing it, but I feel a little silly that it took me so long to get to c5 as soon as you see it, and frankly I feel like I should consider it as sort of my first move in the position here. I mean, probably you look at d takes e5, d5 very briefly, and you make it to c5, and you settle there, and it should be it. I spent a lot of time wasting. I wasted a lot of time thinking about moves like knight d2, knight e1, h4, d5, when it's clear that those moves just, they're okay, but as soon as you see c5, that's it. So I think that, I got the right move here, but I don't feel as good as I should maybe about the time it took me to get the idea. But the move is tremendous. It's just sort of brutal. I think that the reason it took me so long to find this move, as I mentioned in solving it, is that I was thinking about ideas for closed positions, because this looks like a closed sort of King's Indian position. But the position's actually not closed yet. The pawn structure is not locked, and that allows a nice fluid solution here. And so I revealed a little bit of a problem in my line of thinking, that the ideas that I consider tend to be related to whether or not I'm thinking of the position as open or closed. And here I misclassified that position, and that led me to thinking of the wrong type of ideas for the position before I did get to the right move, pawn c5.